This past weekend's Rage Against the War Machine rally and march in Washington, D.C. took place as scheduled. It raised a call for unity across the political spectrum, and that drew criticism from quarters from left to right. Professor Tony Monteiro from the Saturday Free School in Philadelphia was there, as was yours truly, and we discussed what we saw earlier Tuesday. Professor Monteiro, so it was good to see you in D.C. Your impressions?
Yes, it was good to be in D.C., Don. I think what we saw was the beginning of a peace movement of a new type, a peace movement the likes of which we have not seen in this country, a peace movement that is anchored to the discontent and aspirations of working people and lower middle class people, the poor. So this is a peace movement of a new type. In a sense, being at the Lincoln Memorial on what is the 60th year of the historic Civil Rights March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave the very historic, very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It was almost as though it was Martin Luther King, more than even Lincoln, who was calling us to that day and to that place. And, you know, the 3,000 or so people that turned out understood that to secure peace, we must fundamentally change the government of our country. And in that sense, it seems to me that the march on Sunday was part of a great awakening of the American people. And in that sense, I would argue that this march belonged to the American people, contrary to some of those who disparaged it, that saw it as the right wing attempting to co-opt the demands of the peace movement. In fact, I have to say, I didn't hear a right-wing speech given the whole day.
Right.
Those speeches were, if anything, to the left in the political spectrum. The demands, of course, were like none other that have ever defined a peace gathering or peace rally. I mean, literally calling for the end of the CIA and not one more penny for Ukraine, and an end to the military-industrial complex, and an end to government spending causing inflation, and the freedom of Julian Assange. We've never seen demands like this.
Not even now. The ones that the so-called left and so-called anti-war movement are raising, and a couple of representatives that were there, not on the stage but on the sidelines, have to do with calling for a ceasefire, which is what actually the United States would like to see happen also until the winter is over, and for negotiations under the auspices of either Lula, who's condemned Russia, or I forget who the other one is, but someone else that basically would be conducting the negotiations on behalf of the United States.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you mentioned that. If that is the so-called left, then what were the participants in this march?
Right.
Well, I think it's like reversing places. The left seems to be to the right of the people they're calling right. And I would suggest to those who disparage this march to listen to the speeches. I was particularly impressed with Dennis Kucinich's speech, who called upon the American people to make themselves anew. And, you know, for me to use the language of James Baldwin, to make America the last white nation. to make America a nation of peace. And these are not my words. This is what speaker after speaker said, that we want a nation of peace, a nation where the government lives up to a social contract with the people, that education and safety and health care and other things that people need become the priority of the government rather than funding a fascist regime in Kiev. And the other thing is, this march was defined by an outgoingness, a friendliness towards Russia and China and other nations that our government says should be our enemies. So this was a great march. It was, again, a reflection of an awakening, a great awakening. And, Don, you and I have talked about this for many, many years. It is not coming in the ways that many traditional leftists believed it would come in. And that's a problem for them because so many of them are locked in a kind of dogma of what revolution is. And they have become kind of jaded. They don't really like the American people. They don't like the American working class. They see revolution and change and the struggle for peace as literally going in the opposite direction to where the American people are going. But I think this march showed that the American people are moving in the right direction, are increasingly on the right side of history, and don't want to use the Black spiritual, don't want to study war no more, and certainly don't want nuclear war. I think it was a huge event. I don't know how else to assess it. Certainly it was a beginning. Everything was not perfectly done, but when is it that way? But I was very inspired. I think that so many of the people who were there, and I was just impressed with the discipline and orderliness of the crowd and how so many of them literally stood for hours almost at attention, listening to speaker after speaker and encouraging each speaker in their words. I've been to many anti-war marches. I was in many of the anti-Vietnam War marches and demonstrations. I was at the Great March in Central Park in the early 80s, where more than 1 million people turned out against nuclear weapons in Europe, Pershings and other weapons in Europe. I was there. But I think this march heralds something completely new. The other thing is that coming as it did on the cusp of the 2024 presidential election, this is a warning, especially to Biden if he intends to run again, that if he continues this war, there will be no peace. He will not be able to run a campaign like he did in 2020. He will have to go out and hear the protest of the people. And it says to anybody who wishes to run for president and get the support of the people, that at the top of their campaign agenda has to be the question of peace. No war and no more money for Ukraine. No war with China. Peaceful coexistence with Russia, with all of these countries that are allegedly our enemies. This is completely new. It's very exciting. And I think the charge for us is to roll up our sleeves and in our local communities, in our organizations, in our churches, synagogues, mosques, labor unions, that we begin to do the hard work of educating our people, of calling out to the masses urging them on to unity and struggle, and that we, the people, will remake this nation into what it was supposed to be and what it must be if the nation and the world is to survive.
And that is essentially what people were sent home with as a charge from the stage, pretty much across the board. Tony, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully that's where we're headed. Thank you.
Thank you.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.